then make your insulin sensitivity better. And this is shown. I think that, of course, in the future we will
into more cold feels stressful. Back some of the layers as to what the underlying mechanisms of cold are.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really good to just address what actually happens in our physiology when we get cold. And you can get cold in many ways. So you can just head out for the one that gives you the most potent stressor, which is submerging into cold water. But you could also go in outside in the cold wind. That's also gonna activate your sympathetic nervous system, so get all these neurotransmitters going in your body, and so your catecholamines. Let's just address that we are taking a cold plunge, for example. So if you are very hot, for example, before you go into the cold water, it's gonna feel less stressful, but the temperature difference from your skin to the cold is definitely gonna give you a shock, but your core temperature is warmer, and that's gonna feel a little bit better. So that's why when people go into a sauna, for example, and go out then into the cold water, they can do it easier than if they were cold beforehand.
Could I just ask you a few questions? So you mentioned the sympathetic nervous system, which for people listening who aren't familiar with that, is the branch of our nervous system that's responsible for creating accelerations in heart rate, feelings of alertness. It's accompanied with stress and the stress response, but it's accompanied with waking up in the morning, for that matter. So it's not always about stress. And then you mentioned the catecholamines, which are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So maybe a little bit later we'll talk about those individual neurotransmitters. But you raise a really important point, which is something I get asked about a lot from people that are curious about using deliberate cold exposure, which is how cold should the water be? And I know it's very hard to give a straight prescription for that, because I think it boils down to what you just said, which is it's really the difference between your current temperature and really the temperature at the surface of your skin and the temperature of the water. So if you're very warm, getting into cold feels good. If you're already cold, getting into more cold feels stressful. Is there any way that we can start to gauge what is the best way to approach a deliberate cold exposure protocol? I mean, should it feel uncomfortable? And that leads into the question of how do we balance the discomfort with the amount of time that we spend in? So for instance, if it's just a little bit uncomfortable, will spending more time in the cold get us the same benefit as getting into very uncomfortably cold water for a very short period of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I definitely think that this could be future studies on this as well, to really unravel what kind of protocols are the best way, or also for which outcomes, of course. So if the temperature is very cold and you feel that, and you also feel very cold, then you should stay in the water a little bit longer. So I think it's just, you should get uncomfortable cold. So as long as you get uncomfortable cold, it's cold enough, and you get this, what we call the cold shock. So the cold shock is activation of your sympathetic nervous system and these activation of the catecholamines, which you just mentioned before.
Does the shock mean that I'm having trouble controlling my breathing? Is that a good gauge?
Yeah, you can say so, because that's kind of like how we define it. So you hyperventilate, so you have a faster breathing rate. So that increases also because you activate your gasping reflex if you are new to this. But if you are adapted, it kind of subsides with time and with adaptation. So what you can do is that you can train this cold exposure, and you can kind of like get adapted to it, so you don't have this hyperventilating response every time you go out in the cold water. So this is like building up your resilience, building up your adaptation. Is gonna make this shock like subside a bit. So it's always harder in the beginning, but you should do hard things, right? It's not something that you shouldn't think about cold water and cold water immersion as something that is comfortable. It should be hard, because that's the point of it, right? If you enjoy it, then I'm thinking something is wrong. It's not right. You should not enjoy it.
Well, this is an important point that you're making, because I think that many people shy away from deliberate cold exposure because it's uncomfortable in a way that, at least from my experience, is very different than the discomfort of exercise. Because with exercise, for instance, if running hard, running fast and breathing hard is uncomfortable, you can slow down or walk. If lifting weights is uncomfortable, you can remove some weight or reduce the number of repetitions or stop. With deliberate cold exposure, I suppose you can be sort of halfway in, halfway out of the water, or partially underneath the cold shower, but it's very hard to titrate and adjust the level. It's kind of all or none. And I've seen, I can tell this by anecdote, I've done some work with military special operations. I won't say which country, this was outside the US. And these are very tough individuals. They're used to going without sleep and doing hard, high consequence, high risk kind of work. And they were asked to do some cold water exposure training, and I was there that day, and it was remarkable. About a third of them just went straight in and just kind of grinded through it, you know, like they looked stoic anyway to me. There were a few whimpers, no cries. About a third talked a lot and got really, you could tell that they were agitated and anxious, but they made it through. And then about a third of them just simply would not get in past their knees or thighs. It seemed like they were just dreading the whole experience. Some actually didn't go in completely, which was really surprising to me, in that you couldn't tell based on their physical appearance or anything else about them. They're all high performers as to who would have this response. So it seems like people vary tremendously in terms of their ability to embrace the discomfort of the cold. Is that, from your studies, is that your experience as well? Or are there these weird mutants who seem to just love going into the cold for the first time?
So some people just feel better in the cold, and some people dread the cold even more. And you can say the more people are pushing the cold away, they might feel the cold pain even more. So they would definitely, people who are maybe the soldiers you just talked about, some of them might be already adapted to the cold. So if they are not scared of the cold, they go out and they embrace the cold in a better way. It could also be that some people have a more sensitive nervous system, and when you are a bit sensitive to the cold, you will of course try to get away from it, right? And you will also have the cold pain more, feel the cold pain more if you avoid it. So the more you avoid the cold, the more painful it will feel when you go into it. So yeah.
You mentioned being outside in a t-shirt versus cold immersion up to the neck versus shower. I think this is something a lot of people wonder about. What are the differences in terms of impact, short term, and perhaps even long term, between cold showers, cold plunge to the neck, so that could be in ice water or just very cold water, immersion with dunking one's head and then coming up, because obviously we'll have to come up for air at some point, and then simply being outside on a cold day in shorts and a t-shirt or something of that sort?
So there are different outcomes because they are very different exposures of the cold to your cold receptors in your skin. So the more you can say you cover your body in the cold, which you would do in cold water, because they're of course covered totally and the molecules are closer to your skin, you will have a more potent activation of all your cold receptors in the skin. So that one will definitely activate your autonomous nervous system more and rapid compared to going out in a t-shirt in the cold wind, just go for a walk. But that is also something that's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system, meaning then that you will have an increase in norepinephrine and you will activate something called the brown fat. So this is a healthy kind of fat tissue that we have in our body, and when you activate that, that's going to increase your metabolism.
Before we talk about brown fat, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because there's so much to talk about there. What about cold shower? I mean, obviously cold shower is somewhere in between being outside in the air, cold air, versus being immersed up to the neck.
If we had more studies on cold showers, we would learn more about how does that activate our metabolism, how does that increase our neurotransmitters in the brain, which could also have an impact on our mental balance. So I think that would be interesting for the future. But what we do know is from activating brown fat, both from rodent studies but also humans, is that as soon as we get cold on our skin, we will activate our brown fat. So it is kind of like our first responder in the body to keep our temperature up. So our muscles is like the second tissue in our body. We have two tissues which can increase our thermogenesis. So the brown fat which is like always like temperature regulating our body, and then we have the muscles, which will secondarily start to shiver, and that's going to increase our temperature in the body. But as soon as you go into a cold shower, you will activate your brown fat also immediately. So it could be good also for increased metabolism in theory, because we haven't really any studies showing how much does it actually activate the brown fat. So if someone out there wants to do a study,
I think I've thought about why there are fewer studies of cold showers than cold immersion, and I think the answer to my mind is that from a methodological standpoint, it's just harder to do, because if people are getting into cold water up to the neck, they're getting into cold water up to the neck. Whereas if people are getting into a cold shower, some people are larger or smaller, some people are going to stand under the shower with it hitting their head, some people the back of the neck. You could direct people to do it, but it's a little bit more difficult. Also, I think for you and I are both research scientists, there's a little bit of a methodological challenge that might seem silly to people, but it's a real one, which is if people are in a cold shower, also the water is going to be kind of pushing their clothing against their skin. There's a certain vulnerability for most people coming to a laboratory in the first place, let alone being observed while they shower. Whereas when you get into cold immersion, you're getting under the water, and some people might roll their eyes and say, okay, really, is that the barrier? But science exists in these real world contexts, and this will vary by culture and things of that sort. But we run human subjects in my lab, and I'll tell you just the process of getting people to the laboratory and having them park and find the lab, and it's a whole new environment with people in lab coats and people moving around, and where's the restroom? I mean, there's a certain amount of stress just associated with taking part in a study for most human subjects. So I totally agree. However, we need more studies of cold showers. It's just a harder environment to control in my mind. So it sounds like any form of cold to the skin that people register as what you call the cold shock, or uncomfortable, like this is kind of jarring, activates the brown fat. Do we know what the pathway is from cold receptors on the skin to the brown fat? I mean, how does the brown fat know that we're cold?
Yeah, really good question. And it seems that I think that, of course, in the future we will know much more about these pathways. But what we do know is that the cold receptors will send a signal to our temperature regulating center in the brain, so hypothalamus, and that's going to be taking in this message. We have so many cold receptors in the skin, so it's going to be very fast. As you can say, if you immerse the body into cold water, this is going to be so rapid, so it will have a rapid increase in neurotransmitters in the brain, from noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol, and which is not that much, but it's still there. So you have this increase in noradrenaline, which will then immediately activate the brown fat, because you can say the activator is the most potent one, cold, and noradrenaline. That's going to activate the brown fat. But there's also a direct pathway from the cold receptors in the skin to the brown fat, which really shows that because of these different pathways, it shows that it could be that this tissue to keep us warm was developed in our evolvement as humans to keep us warm and to save us whenever the temperature on our skin varies just a little bit, to keep us in that right homeostatic balance, so we don't get hypothermic, but also so we don't get hyperthermic. But because it seems that the brown fat is also activated when we get warmer on our skin, so it's also maybe a temperature regulator in our body. But the pathways is different. I think it's also a third pathway directly from the muscles. So the brown fat is also activated even though the muscles are starting to shiver. So there's an extra pathway that way to keep our temperature up. So muscles and brown fat are working together to keep us warm, so we don't suffer too much in the cold water.
Super interesting. And what I hear you pointing to is the existence of 3 parallel pathways. And this notion of parallel pathways comes up over and over again in biology, as you and I know. And I think it's important for people to know about, because as you said so eloquently, when something is very important to our survival or evolution, the brain and body install multiple mechanisms for it, not just one. And so it sounds like it's cold skin, cold on the skin triggers a response in the hypothalamus, which then activates brown fat. Cold receptors in the skin directly to the brown fat, and then shivering in the muscle to the brown fat. I want to talk about brown fat in depth and learn from more about brown fat. Before that, however, I want to ask about shiver. I've heard that shiver causes the release of succinate, which then activates the brown fat. Is it known whether or not inducing shiver is important? And when should people shiver? I mean, I've gotten into cold plunges and shivered while I was in there. And then I've also had the experience of getting into a cold plunge or a cold shower, then getting out, or even standing outside on a warm day after swimming in a pool and then starting to shiver. So the shiver comes later. So how important is shiver, and does it matter when shiver happens?
Yeah, well, shivering is good because that increases your metabolism, and that's going to burn some calories in your body. You shouldn't be so afraid of shivering, I think, because the shivering, as long as you don't get too hypothermic, so if you don't sit in the cold water for too long, and what you just said by shivering after you get up, that is because of the afterdrop. Something called the afterdrop is when your core temperature decreases even after you get out of the cold water. And it always does that, your body, because as soon as you get into the cold water, all the blood vessels is going to constrict, because you need to keep your blood in your core and keep your vital organs warm. So as soon as you get up, those blood vessels will open again, and the warm blood will flow out and get colder and then flow back again into the core, and that's going to decrease the temperature in your core, of course.
So that's the drop.
So that's the drop.
Got it. Oh, I'm so glad you explained that. I've heard years ago, Wim Hof, I heard him talk about the drop, and I've heard colleagues of mine talk about the drop, but that's the first time I've ever heard it explained clearly. Let me make sure I understand this. So I get into cold water. Obviously, I'm cold. Vessels constrict to keep blood near the center of my body, keep me alive. I get out. Warming up of my body allows those vessels and capillaries to dilate again. The blood goes out to the surface, but the surface is still cold, and so that blood is cooled, and then my core body temperature drops, and that's what you're referring to as the drop, and that's what induces shivering. Great. And then, am I right in thinking that then the shiver activates brown fat, which then warms me up again?
Yes.
Got it.
That's why you should end on the cold. We could get back to that.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yes, ending on cold is, it's what I refer to as, and what has now become known as, the sober principle, which is a really important principle about the importance of ending on cold, and not doing what I do, which is to get into a hot shower or back in the sauna. But we'll get back to that in a few minutes. So that's wonderful that you can explain that so clearly, because I think that shiver is something that a lot of people do avoid. People that go, I don't want that, the chattering of the teeth, and it feels like a loss of bodily control, which really it is. It's an autonomic response.
Yeah, but I don't think that people should avoid it that much. It's just like seeing shivering as a way of your body in a like it's training. It's training for all your cells. It's training for your muscles. It's training of your metabolism, and that's going to increase your what's called the insulin sensitivity. So if you can in your mind get used to the thought of shivering is just like when you go exercising in the training center and get that feeling of like, oh, this is tough, now it hurts a little bit. Yeah, it's gonna hurt because that's what shivering also does, but it's just a different way of training your cells in your body. It's gonna create what is healthy stress. It's called homeostasis in the cells, and the more you expose your muscle cells or your brown fat cells to these kind of like healthy stresses, exercise, cold, heat exposure, it's gonna make them better at like activating and also at keeping you healthy. So as long as the cells get exposed to this, it's going to keep them on its toes, you can say, because it becomes more robust, increasing these heat shock proteins and cold shock proteins in the cells to make you more robust for the next time. And that is also what happens when you go